All right, hi everybody. I'd like to take a couple minutes here to introduce the idea of taxonomy. You can see here in this Prezi that I just have a little brief taxonomy 101, basically what is it, how does it work, a little bit of history, and then a couple of examples. And then at that point I will get into the material that constitutes sort of the meat of chapter 20 from your textbook. Okay, so let's zoom in here and go to the Taxonomy 101 section. The first question is, what is it? And basically, it's a way to organize life. You might ask why we need to organize life. And I'd just like to give you this example. Here we have a mess of different kinds of organisms. We have several different kinds of plants. The rest of them are animals. Some are higher level of taxonomic organization. Some are the lowest, the species level. And what taxonomy does is it just does what humans generally or inherently rather need, and that's they need to organize things. If you organize these things into groups with similar characteristics, it makes it easier for us to understand it. It makes it easier to remember it, and most importantly, it helps. It helps us see the relationships among living things, which is the diversity section of this course will focus on that. So it sounds like a good idea. I think we can all agree on, and we can attribute the idea to this guy. This guy came up in the section on the history of evolutionary thought. This is Linnaeus. And remember that he is the one that basically the father of modern taxonomy. Remember that he was not an evolutionist, though. Not until this guy, Darwin, came along did we start thinking of taxonomy as a way of describing um, not only defining organisms, but defining their relationships with other organisms. Remember that this is Darwin's first phylogenetic tree, and he talks in his notebook about the relationship among these different taxa at the tips of this tree, and how they shared common ancestors, and when they shared common ancestors, and when they diverged from each other. All right, so that's the basics on what it is. The next question I'd like to tackle is, how does it work? And again, we're going to get into this in a little bit of detail. But the first thing I would like you to understand is that taxonomic organization is hierarchical. Kingdom is a larger group that has various phyla nested within it. For example, the phylum Arthropoda and the phylum Chordata are nested within the kingdom Animalia. And as you go down to finer taxonomic organization, as we'll see, the members of each group get more and more similar. Okay, so I'll use a couple examples to illustrate this hierarchical nature of taxonomy. The other thing is these words that we'll learn when we go through the diversity section of the course are actually descriptive. We don't have formal training in Latin or Greek, but if you make an attempt to look up some of these words, you will notice that they actually have meaning. Homo sapiens, for example, means wise man or wise human. Tyrannosaurus rex has a meaning too that I encourage you to look up. When I was going through taxonomy, when I was basically taking the equivalent of Bio 105, I used a Latin and Greek glossary to sort of drive home the meaning of some of these terms. I found it easier to remember these terms if I could attach some meaning to them. one of the most important things to remember about taxonomic organization and phylogenetic relationships is that it's based on common ancestry. And so um, you want to make sure to use homologous structures in a tree. And let me tell you, if for example, you used the presence of fins without looking at the underlying anatomy of those fins, you might say that whales and dolphins were more closely related to fish than they were to humans, and that would be erroneous because of the common ancestry shared and the underlying homologous structures present in these organisms. Finally, taxonomy and phylogenetics describe, ever since Darwin anyway, evolutionary relationships. If you look at phylogenetic trees, they describe not only relationships among organisms at the tips of the trees, but the time period since they last shared a common ancestor. So we'll get to this idea of divergence when we study this more formally, but I just wanted to mention this now. And I think that maybe in order to understand this, we can go back to Darwin's tree here. For example, what this tree is saying is that B and C, because they shared a common ancestor more recently than C and A, are more closely related. Okay, they diverged more recently than A and C, or A and the rest of them for that matter, diverged. All right, so let's go over an example. This is an example of organisms that make up classes within the phylum Chordata. Chordates, most chordates are vertebrates. There are some invertebrate chordates, but we'll forget about those for now. Comprise animals that have four main characteristics in common, at least in some point in their life history: a notochord, a dorsal hollow nerve cord, pharyngeal gill slits, and a post-anal tail. Okay, so that's what binds all of these animals together. And that's at the phylum level. If you zoom in on just these animals, you are looking at a class of chordates called class Mammalia. And you probably know this, but mammals have hair, the females lactate, there's some other common characteristics. But they include things like mice and dogs and cats and monkeys and apes. If you zoom in on these three organisms here, we're looking at order level classification. This is the order Primates. If you zoom in on just these two, the chimp and the human, you're looking at a group of animals that constitutes the great apes. And then finally, you zoom in on a species of great ape called Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens is a chordate, it's a mammal, it's a primate, and it's an ape. And so this is what I mean by the hierarchical level of taxonomy. Let's look at one more example, and we'll just display it in a slightly different way. This is an economically important insect called the emerald ash borer. It is in the same kingdom as us. We're animals. We're in the kingdom Animalia. But unlike us, it's in the phylum Arthropoda. So arthropods include things like shrimp and crabs and insects. Insects are all in the subphylum Hexapoda, class Insecta. So let's look at this word Hexapoda. This is a meaningful word. It means six-footed or six-legged. And so you probably know from elementary school that insects have 3 pairs of jointed legs. It is in the order Coleoptera, which includes all of the beetles. It is in the family Buprestidae, genus Agrillus, species Planopennis. And so as you go from kingdom to phylum to order to family to species and all of those in between, you get more and more narrow. That's what I mean by the hierarchical levels of taxonomy, that is. Okay? So, what I want to do next, I'm going to stop now, but what I want to do in the next video is get a little bit more in depth into what phylogenetics and systematics is, and I'll introduce some some technical terms, and we will go through some examples of how phylogenetics works. Okay? Thanks, everybody.